Greetings and welcome, valued podcast listener, to the Dark Roast Cult podcast. Today we're going to be sipping coffees and talking about death. And then we're going to get into your emails. Off the top, I'd like to thank everybody who submitted their experiences or sent in an email for me to read. And if you at home have something you might want to submit, the email is submityourscare@gmail.com. You can send me an email there, and I will be reading them here on the podcast. If you can remember a time when you put yourself in danger as a child, perhaps a horrifying experience in a forest, a late-night shift that got a little weird. Ever see something you can't quite explain? Maybe something in the woods, or in your house, or at the foot of your bed? We want to hear it. Submityourscare@gmail.com. That's the email to use if you have something you want to tell us. Have you ever encountered a demon? Been followed? Dabbled in witchcraft? Ended up somewhere you shouldn't have been? Have you ever been kept awake at night by the screams or other... Have you ever been kept awake at night by screams or other unexplainable sounds? Send in your story. Submityourscare@gmail.com. The Dark Roast Cult podcast is an ad-free podcast, and you can help keep it that way by checking out our website, darkroastcult.com. We will soon have our very own Dark Roast Cult coffee. Check out the Patreon, patreon.com/darkroastcult, if you want to get the podcast before anybody else does. And join the Discord. That's where you can chat with me and other cool people. Alright, I think that's the entire plug. Stay tuned for that. That's the entire plug. So today, before we get to your emails, I have 3 stories from around the world. Milo of Croton. More than 2,000 years ago, in what is now the Italian city of Crotone, lived a man known as the strongest person who ever lived. Milo was an athlete in ancient Greece in the late 6th century, specifically a 6-time Olympic wrestling champion, competing in various Olympic Games between the 60th and 66th Olympiads, also holding several wrestling championship titles in different Pythian games. This was wrestling, before a time when your championship title could be threatened by a man in tights jumping from the top of the cage with a folding chair. This wrestling was far less interesting. Milo was not only known for his ability to pin other muscular men to the ground. He was also the celebrated leader of the Crotonate army and their victory of the Battle of 510 BCE, when another neighboring town attempted a siege on Croton. He is known to have even once held the pillar up of a collapsing building, just long enough for the people inside to escape, before dashing to safety himself. With all of that under his proverbial championship belt, Milo still wasn't about to let those around go without knowing who the muscular Greek athlete was. He took great pleasure in showing off his muscular abilities while performing feats of strength to those who would crowd around and those who might take on some of his challenges. Some of the fan favorites he was said to perform were challenging those around to take a pomegranate from his hand while he gripped it tight, somehow without damaging it, standing on a greased iron disc while he had bystanders attempt to push him off of it. Sometimes, the challenge to people was just to bend his outstretched fingers, which apparently was challenge enough. During training between Olympics, Milo would carry a newborn calf on his back every day until the start of the Olympics. And by that time, the cow was 4 years old. On the first day of the Olympics, he would carry the cow the length of the stadium, kill, roast, and eat it, as the crowd cheered, just to give you an idea of how strong and muscular Milo was said to be. However, while it isn't wrong to be strong, allowing it to consume every fiber of your being doesn't tend to go well. As legend has it, his last feat of strength is what caused his death. While traveling, Milo came across a villager who was attempting to split a tree stump with a hammer and wedges. Milo was ecstatic to be able to show off for this unknown man. He offered to split the stump for the man who was struggling, using nothing other than his hands and strength. To thank Milo for his help, he ran to town to get food to offer the muscular man who was about to handle his stump. Milo inserted his thick fingers where the man had been hammering wedges into the wood, in an attempt to break the tree apart. As he pulled the stump apart, the wedges fell free, and with nothing holding the splits in the fallen tree open, the trunk clamped back down and he was unable to outmuscle the tree, his hands now being crushed within the stump. When Milo ultimately was unable to free himself from his wooden finger trap, he became easy opportunity. When either his screaming or the blood from his damaged fingers attracted dangerous wildlife, be it a lion, bear, or a pack of wolves, it varies from story to story. What we do know is that Milo was in a predicament that something took advantage of. The scene was gruesome, and the once great Milo was no longer when the villager returned. When they say the boy in our next story was kissed to death, that isn't quite true. February 15th, 1909. George Spencer Millett was an American teen boy working in an office building in downtown Manhattan on the day after his birthday, when the blonde, newly 15-year-old George found himself under the threat of kisses. One for every year that he had been alive on this planet Earth. George had been told by some of the female stenographers that he was going to be ambushed at the end of the day and given birthday kisses. One for every year that he had been on this planet Earth. And come the end of day, the stenographers followed through with their promise. With George being a shy young man, he gave chase. Uncomfortable and overwhelmed, George ran through the office building to avoid the women. During the bout of seemingly harmless teasing, while running and avoiding smooches, George tripped and fell to the floor. While lying on the ground, knowing exactly what had just happened, George screamed out, "I've been stabbed." One of George's tools of his trade was something called an ink eraser. Unlike an eraser you may have used, an ink eraser is a knife-like instrument with a long handle and a knife or spearhead-style blade on the end, used to shave and scrape ink from writing surfaces in a time when permanent writing was done in ink. And George's was now puncturing his heart. His ink eraser, kept in his breast pocket, pierced his chest as he fell to the floor, and he fell with such force the blade entered his body and went right for his heart, leaving his fellow office workers with a belated bloody Valentine. An ambulance was called, but George didn't make it to the hospital, dying from hemorrhaging. The girls were brought in for police questioning, with one even being held for homicide charges, but was let go due to lack of evidence. George Spencer Millett was the boy accidentally stabbed to death in an office frolic. If you find yourself in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, you may find George's headstone. His death so absurd, it had to be carved into the stone that marked his grave. It reads, "Lost life by stab in falling on ink eraser. Evading 6 young women trying to give him birthday kisses in office Metropolitan Life building." Death. It's not always a finale or an ending, an unexpected thing lurking around the corner. Sometimes it can be a destination. Like in the instance of Rupkund, a small, high-altitude glacial lake in the Himalayas, no more than 40 meters in diameter and 3 meters deep. Surrounded by picturesque rock faces, it makes a fantastic place for tourists and photographers. This body of water is so small, it's almost insignificant, would it not be for the hundreds of human skeletons found at the bottom? For 1 month of the year, the ice and snow around the lake melt and reveal the gruesome puddle's true nature. Discovered for a second time in 1942 by a forest ranger. As it was during the time of World War II, it was first thought that the skeletons had been the result of an unknown Japanese invasion that perished while trying to cross the mountain range. But upon further investigation, it was discovered that the remains were far too old. It was also revealed through radiocarbon dating that not only do the remains date back to the 9th century, but actually 2 different time periods of the 9th century, with some being more than 800 years apart and showing to come from different ancestries, meaning there were 2 events over a period of time, depositing all these bodies. Amongst the bones, some still with flesh on them, are also wooden artifacts, iron spearheads, leather slippers, and jewelry. According to an anthropological survey of the mysterious forbidden broth, the most common cause of death amongst the skeletons studied were head injuries. Head injuries caused by round objects coming from above, which lines up with the local legend of the king and his pregnant wife, who took their servants on a pilgrimage and were caught up in a storm where they were pelted to death with hailstones. What could be more concerning than a small lake filled with hundreds of random skeletons is the amount of bones, which seems to be dwindling. The assumed cause is tourists picking up human bones and taking them as souvenirs, or something worse. Trust me, it may seem like a good idea to desecrate a mass grave and take human bones home with you, but it's not worth the poltergeisting. It may seem like a good idea at the time to collect human bones and bring them to your house, but if they're not your bones, they're not your bones. And now you've got one closet you'll never be able to use again. If they're not your bones, don't touch them. Put those bones back. Those aren't your bones. Don't touch those bones. This has been a message from your friends at the Dark Roast Cult. So there you have it, a few stories from around the world. Now I think it's time we get into some emails. Are you ready for bed? According to this email, it's all fun and games until the Hat Man comes to collect. I've been watching horror movies and reading scary stories since 5, maybe younger. Laughing in the face of horror and only at the time afraid of the dark and bedbugs. After a few experiences, though, I cannot say with confidence that there is nothing beyond this plane of existence. As a kid, I've always felt as if I was being watched. Whether if it's actually paranormal or untreated mental illness, I'll never know. But that's all I've known. I'd feel that sensation. I'd hear footsteps, and I swear I've seen a disembodied hand once in the bathroom. But my 8th grade year, it got a bit more intense. In 8th grade, I started to sleep by myself, because I myself realized it was starting to become weird that I was still sleeping with my grandma. I was the kid who never wanted to grow up and stay young forever. And for some reason, neither my friends nor my grandma questioned it. And there's nothing wrong with staying a child at heart, but sometimes you gotta sleep in your big boy bed. So it's only 2 or 3 nights after I started sleeping by myself, and I woke up not being able to move. I heard the low sound of the small grandfather in the living room. Then a feeling of dread washed over me as I heard my door slide open. As soon as an inch of the door was open, half of my face was covered. I couldn't see who or what it was. I'm gonna preface this by saying it didn't necessarily feel like something was sitting on me, but it felt as if someone was on top of me, hungry, and not for food. Suddenly, I felt my hands fly back as if I was being pinned down. I thrashed, or attempted to, and eventually I got my eyes completely open. I saw nothing, but my hands were in the position of being pinned down, facing up. Considering I'm a side sleeper and I keep my hands curled inward, this was weird. Well, believe me when I say that I went straight to my grandma's room and slept there for another whole year. and no longer slept in the dark until recently. My next part thankfully didn't happen the next year, but in 2020. Now I'm going to let you know that my light was on before I slept because of the previous incident, where I had only had a little light from the living room through the slits in my sliding louvered doors, which I think is kind of like the shuttered doors that sometimes are in existence, I guess. Sort of like the shuttered doors you sometimes see on closets. I lived in an apartment at the time with my current partner, but they worked at night, so I was alone when I slept. This night, I woke up with the inability to move, and I thought, oh no, this isn't good. That's a very fair reaction. I might have even added a cuss word in there, to be honest, to really show that I was concerned with the terrible thing happening, but that's just me. I'm 24 at this point, and have no patience for this. So I closed my eyes and decided not to deal with it. But I felt it there, and I heard it walk over to my side of the bed. It stood right over me, and I felt it stare on me until eventually I fell asleep. I now wiggle my fingers before I sleep, like right before I'm unconscious, and make sure that I'm full on my side when I sleep. And that seems to help me. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone, I still feel something with me. Our next email proves that sometimes when you work a dull job, you've gotta let off a little steam. I was working for a paranormal investigative show for a hot minute. I was the camera operator and editor. The guy who ran the show was pretty bonkers and fully believed that every little sound was a ghost and had me doing replays every few seconds, which was horrible to watch. But not my show, so whatever. That's a tactic that's used throughout a lot of ghost hunting shows. They replay a sound over and over again and then tell you what they want you to think it is. It could be literally anything, but it could also be a ghost saying, "Hey, what's up?" To be determined. Well, one day we were investigating the Peterborough Lift Lock Bridge because someone died there during the construction, and there's stories of the guy walking around or something. I'm pretty sure it was bullshit, but this guy would go anywhere if there was even a single story he had heard through the grapevine. Anyway, we were walking along and I was like, I'm probably not going to use this. We were just walking to another area and I had to toot, so I did, and I forgot about it. As you should with every toot. Stop logging your toots if that's what you're doing. Well, in editing, I used the clip of my fart without realizing it, and I sent him the first round of edits to be reviewed. He comes back and gives me the time code for the fart clip and says, "It's a ghost saying get out." And I listened back, and the memory of the fart came to me like a Nom flashback. I think I included it in the final edit because it was so fucking dumb. I never actually saw any real evidence of ghosts while making that show, but between the fart incident and this 10-minute sequence that he wouldn't let me cut, that was just him chasing a shadow that the camera didn't see, I got some good laughs. And finally, everyone loves a family secret, until it's their family, and they're the one testifying in court. Here's a story about my father. I was born to a father who, up until my birth, seemed like a normal guy to everyone. However, shortly after my birth, he decided an infant was simply too annoying and began throwing me against walls like an alarm clock anytime I made a sound. That's just bad dad 101. I quickly learned not to make a sound until one day I simply wouldn't shut up. So my mother rushed to a hospital where it was discovered he completely smashed my shoulder. Naturally, CPS got involved, but ultimately a few excuses quickly made them go away. After that point, my father decided the ultimate escape move was repeated acts of terrorism by building fake bombs and planting them at work before calling in a threat, which eventually led to a short prison sentence. While my parents' relationship fell apart at this time, he did still have visitation rights the second he got out of prison, which led to me being shipped back and forth to what was now an abusive alcoholic. Now you'd think he couldn't top being an abusive alcoholic terrorist, but you'd be wrong. While thankfully sat at my grandparents', the FBI promptly burst in and raided all electronics in my house. Why, you may ask? Because it turns out my father was a pedophile who had just been caught abusing his niece and the FBI had put cameras in my home watching him for years while they built a case. He was once again promptly imprisoned, and I was given a protection order until I turned 16. Now, you might think that, well, hey, at least you're finally safe. But don't worry. My father decided to spend his time in prison sending lawyers to my school to interrogate me to try to get me to drop the protection order, which is super illegal, by the way. Unfortunately, once again, he eventually got released, and by now, you can probably guess he didn't care about the restraining order, as the man spent every opportunity stalking me until lockdown, where he finally lost track of me. Thanks once again to everybody who sent in an email and submitted a story, something for me to read. I appreciate each and every one of you joining me on this caffeinated look into the dark and mysterious. If you yourself have something you want to send in for me to read in future podcasts, send it to submityourscare@gmail.com. I'll be reading them for future podcasts to come, as well as bringing you creepy and dark stories from around the world. If you've had a spooky, scary, near-death experience, I would love to hear about it. And I would love to read about it for future podcasts. If you enjoy the podcast and you want to get it early before all your friends, go to patreon.com/darkroastcult and sign up for just $1 a month. We put out all of our podcasts early for everybody before we upload them to the feed, so you can get them early. I want to thank Andrew for making the theme song, and both Jordan and Jake for making this podcast sound so good. I'm going to put all of their links in the show notes to this podcast, as well as all of the links to the website, the Patreon, and the Discord. Check it out. Thank you all for listening. I love you all. Good night.